All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Jill Lackett at the North Central Climate Science Center, and this is our monthly check-in call. We have today Shelley Crosby with us as our speaker, and she is a plant community ecologist, ecological modeler, and paleoecologist. And she's a research affiliate with us here at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, I guess we are now, and also a lead scientist at Conservation Science Partners here in Fort Collins. And she's going to be talking to us today about the SNAPP Ecological Drought Working Group. So welcome, Shelley, and when you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Great, thanks, Jill. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our SNAPP Ecological Drought Working Group. And this is a group we started just over 2 years ago, so we're still kind of in the middle of things. Okay, so just to get us started, where did SNAPP and this idea of SNAPP come from? So this is all rooted in the National Climate Adaptation Science Center's focus on ecological drought. And so basically, the NCASC started thinking that ecological drought was a big issue. Ecosystems are more vulnerable to droughts in the 21st century for various reasons, because the exposure is stronger with climate change, because our land use patterns and water use patterns make ecosystems more sensitive. And these ecological drought impacts can be quite widespread and really perhaps quite persistent, where you see really dramatic ecological changes that in turn will translate into big losses or big changes in ecosystem services that human communities may rely on. But these risks to ecosystems really aren't taken into account. Either in drought planning, and sometimes, these drought risks to ecosystems aren't taken fully into account in natural resource management as well. So we wanted to try and put ecological drought on the table, essentially. And so the National Climate Adaptation Science Center has sort of 4 approaches to ecological drought. They have a body of funded research that is specifically about drought. They have a webinar series focused on that research around drought. They've hosted regional workshops across each of the climate then science centers. And the 4th prong, where they're trying to focus on ecological drought, is by funding and sort of launching this SNAPP Ecological Drought Working Group. And so I'll just give you a little bit of information on what SNAPP is. So it's a partnership among NCEAS, that's the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, that's out of UC Santa Barbara, but also with the Nature Conservancy and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And the idea is to integrate policymakers and field practitioners and scientists all together to try and bridge that gap between, analysis and science and actual action on the ground. And they particularly want to address key questions that are right at this intersection between human well-being as well as nature conservation. And so they tend to tackle some pretty difficult and super interesting issues, and you can see a range of them here. And you can sort of think about how ecological drought fits in this SNAPP working group framework. So our Ecological Drought Working Group is led by Kim Hall with the Nature Conservancy and Molly Cross with the Wildlife Conservation Society, as well as Sean Carter there at the National Center for Climate Adaptation Science. How does it go? I'm forgetting the acronym.
National Climate Adaptation Science Center.
Right, formerly known as NCWIS. Anyway, these are our fearless leaders, and then we put together a working group to where we're almost about 20 people. And I, and along with Aaron Ramirez, we were postdocs on this project, and I was lucky enough to be able to sit here at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center to do that work. So super appreciative of that. So our working group, as we come together, we're sort of, you could think of us as an example of co-production, but on a national scale. And our expertise of these, 20 some odd people really sort of fit into 2 categories. There was either, a lot of focus on natural science, be it climate or ecology, as well as adaptation and natural resource management. And then we had another, really the strongest contingent of our group, had a lot of expertise in planning, drought planning, as well as social science. So what I'm going to go through today are, various arms of our Ecological Drought Working Group and the kinds of products that we're putting forward. And so again, I just want to remind you, we're 2 years in. We have another sort of year plus of funding to finish these things out. So I'll talk about the things that are out first, but then as I move around the dial there, I'll be talking about more preliminary work that the SNAPP Working Group is focused on. So just to get started, the first thing we wanted to do is really define ecological drought and create a framework for it. And here we're sort of thinking maybe similar to what Socrates allegedly said, that the beginning of wisdom is definitions. It's all rooted in definitions. And we know that we have a lot of good definitions through our friends at the National Drought Mitigation Center. We know about meteorological drought. We know that there are impacts that are felt that can be described as agricultural drought, hydrological drought, or socioeconomic drought. But they're really, lately we've been experiencing these widespread ecological impacts from drought, and there just hasn't been a bin to put them in. And so that's why we really feel that we needed the ecological drought definition. So we just got a paper out in BAMS that defines ecological drought, and our whole working group, contributed to this. So it's a really, diverse set of perspectives that we put in here. And our definition is an episodic deficit in water availability that drives ecosystems beyond thresholds of vulnerability to impact ecosystem services and trigger feedbacks in natural and human systems. And those feedbacks are pretty important from the way we're thinking about it. So when we put a framework together, we thought about two major axes. So first we have, ideas about drought exposure, and then the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of these ecological systems until you get down to the point of experiencing an ecological drought impact because thresholds were crossed. But we also know there's a very important second axis here, which is, all of these processes these days are driven both by, natural processes as well as human processes. And so we wanted to really explicitly recognize that reality of the 21st century. But we also wanted to note that when you do experience an ecological drought impact, either on the natural side or on the human side through loss of ecosystem services, there will be feedbacks that are going to move back up and influence the likelihood of future ecological drought impacts. So here I'm showing a figure from our BAMS paper that sort of lines out the ecological drought framework. So you can see moving from top to bottom, we have exposure and all the elements of exposure that we pointed out, meteorological drought, in yellow describing the natural processes and landscape characteristics. But then on the human side in blue, we also need to account for anthropogenic climate change as well as human land and water use. So all of those bubbles together really effectively describe a system's exposure to drought. And then because we're talking about ecosystems, we know that these ecological characteristics really matter, as well as on the human side of that coin, how we perform our natural resource management these days. So once you cross the threshold of vulnerability, there can be ecological impacts such as widespread tree mortality, fish kills, things like that. And those impacts will in turn influence people through the changes or the losses of ecosystem services. And then again, those feedbacks are coming back in to influence the future situation for upcoming droughts. So that sort of describes in a nutshell our ecological drought framework, but we wanted to sort of put it to work on the landscape. And so we partnered with the National Drought Resilience Partnership. This was something that was started in the Obama administration sort of in 2015, 2014. And the idea was to provide tools for drought monitoring and forecasting and to try and work to link all of the, many pieces of drought information we have with more preparedness strategies, trying to get away from reactive responses to drought. But mostly the idea was to use all this federal, expertise to try and develop local and regional capacity. That's the most important part. And so the National Drought Resilience Partnership selected the Upper Missouri headwaters in Montana. You can see the little sort of gray shape at the very root of that Missouri River. And we don't know why Obama selected the Upper Missouri headwaters as the location for this case study, but we're super excited that he did, because here in this part of Montana, the ecological impacts are really strongly seen in the community through fish kills that then result in changes to tourism and things like that. And so ecological impacts are really at the forefront in this location. So the way this demonstration project is operating is that each HUC 8 level watershed in the Upper Missouri Headwaters is creating a drought plan. And overall, each of these HUCs are going to come together to have a whole basin drought plan, and they also have sort of a task force around that. So, okay, let's get started with some of these other arms here. So we started by thinking about drought plans. And we simply asked the question, do drought plans even consider ecological impacts here in this landscape? So we took a look at 5 different plans, one fairly old from 1988, several quite recent, throughout not only the Upper Missouri Headwaters, but up further into Montana. And what we found was that the degree to which ecological impacts are even considered in drought plans is really very minor. Fish and fisheries, are considered more frequently and more seriously than in other plans. Forests and grasslands, any kind of ecological issue there is maybe just a side mention. It's not actually a formal component of the drought plan. We asked whether drought plans considered ecologically relevant indicators, and we learned that they really have 2 indicators across all these drought plans: stream flows and water temperature. And that's it. There are no indicators that could lead you to understand what's going on in forests or grasslands. And so that really seemed like an opportunity from our perspective to try and get these kinds of ideas into these drought plans. So Jamie McAvoy and others just published this paper in Resources describing that research. And Tanya Hay with NDMC and others, Mike Hayes and Deb Bathke and others are also leading a paper to look at the fragmented responsibility for, who's really managing this ecologically available water and what's that institutional landscape like. Okay, so moving on to ecosystem services. For us, this was a really important piece. We felt like, how do you get ecosystems into drought plans if you don't recognize their value in other situations? And so Ann Schwind, who's leading the Basin Task Force, decided, let's start our drought planning process by thinking about the ecosystem services that we care about. And so we have 2 environmental economists on our working group, and they are leading an effort to try and classify the ecosystem services in this landscape. And so what we did is we met with the entire Upper Missouri Headwaters Basin Task Force. This is sort of the first major group meeting these guys had. And we spent, a whole morning trying to come up with, okay, what are the ecosystem services that we care about? And we divvied them up based on different landscapes: forests, grasslands, and rivers and riparian areas. And that paper was just submitted to Wires Water. And I'm just showing you a real small portion of this. These tables are quite long and thick to go through. The rest of the work I'm going to talk about is really rooted in some stakeholder perspectives that we gathered in the area. So we conducted interviews. We had 45 individuals that we interviewed, and these were all individuals that were involved in the National Drought Resilience Partnership. And I've listed the acronyms of the different federal agencies, and the Montana DNRC, as well as some NGOs were involved in that. We had a series of questions that we asked in these interviews, so a bunch of projects are sort of stemming from the interviews. How do you define drought? What are the ecological impacts that you see in the UMH? What indicators are you using? Are there NBS, so that stands for nature-based strategies? That's a big focus that I'll go into. What are barriers and opportunities to that? And what are the science and information needs to really address the ecological aspects of drought? So thinking about those responses to drought, we're very, very early on in this data set, but what we have pulled out is 37 unique drought responses, and you can see the number of sources, the number of folks who sort of mention those things. And these are things like, natural water storage, grass banking, water banking, forest management, landscape restoration, lots of really cool stuff to think about that's really very preparatory in thinking about drought response. But Jamie McAvoy is really leading this work, and she's very interested in the idea of nature-based solutions or mutually beneficial solutions. So these are actions you take on the landscape that are not only good for conservation, but are also good for people too. It's really a mutually beneficial situation. And so I'm showing you a few pictures there, thinking about some really cool things that are going on in Montana, such as candidate conservation agreement with assurances. So in the Big Hole, the Arctic grayling is potentially slated for listing soon. Landowners are doing some voluntary changes to their land management and their water use that's specified in this CCAA plan, and that way, if the grayling is listed, these landowners are protected from legal obligations. Also, there's shared sacrifice that goes on in Montana, so you can cut back on your water diversions during low flow without having a risk of losing your water rights. And as well, beaver mimicry, the picture on the bottom left. A lot of folks in Montana are thinking about, we've lost beaver on the landscape. How can we, at least, if we're not restoring them, can we restore their structures or mimic their structures so we can hold water on the landscape a little bit longer? So Jamie's leading this effort, and that's going to be work that'll be coming out soon, focused on responses. Okay, so finally, the interviews also taught us a little bit about thinking about mismatches between science, management, and planning. And so here we thought, there's a basic sort of 5-step drought planning process that's out there through the NDMC and others. And we wanted to look at our interview data and understand what are the stakeholder needs and which part of this planning process do those needs really fit in. And at the same time, we want to take a look at what is the state of ecological drought science, and is the science meeting the stakeholder needs? Is the science working in such a way that it can fit those steps? But at the same time, we're recognizing that the science may be recognizing situations like complete transformation of your ecological system that might be a little bit outside of this process. And so how can we recognize these mismatches and try and think a little bit more forward-looking to deal with drought in the 21st century? And so this is a paper I'm working on with Amanda Cravens and others to determine these mismatches. And okay, so we're almost round the horn here, and we did actually look at ecological impacts, and we did a little ecological science. So we wanted to look at past ecological impacts and understand the vulnerability. And we use our ecological drought framework to understand what those potential drivers are. And the thinking here is, if we understand these different drivers, we will be able to connect those drivers to different strategies that may be successful at reducing your vulnerability to ecological impacts in the future. And so what we did is we looked in the past, the not so distant past. So this is a graph from 2000 through 2018. It's showing the percent area under either very moderate drought in yellow or really extreme drought in dark red. You can see in the early 2000s, there was a very strong drought that persisted for several years in the upper Missouri Headwaters Basin. And here I'm showing you what that ecological impact was in forests. So after that time period, this is showing you the trend in forest health in the area. And so the red pixels are showing you a negative trend, an unhealthy trend, suggesting these trees are likely dead. The tan areas, there's no change in health, and the blue, perhaps even an improvement over this 5 or 6 year time period. And then we're using just typical distribution modeling techniques to model, well, what drove that drought? Why were those impacts in those spatial locations? And so we're looking at the EDI, the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. We did learn from stakeholders in the interviews that they want to be able to link ecological impacts to drought indices that are out there and to triggers that are out there. But we considered a suite of things: soil moisture, snow water equivalent, all sorts of stuff. But we also looked at the landscape characteristics, the heat loading index, the topographic position, position along a mean climatic water deficit, as well as ecological characteristics like the percent tree canopy, connectivity in forests, that sort of thing. And so the idea is that this should point to some strategies. You could monitor the EDI, you could improve natural water storage, you could attempt to improve soil health. If landscape characteristics matter, you could more easily predict the locations of future impacts, and ecological characteristics might lead you to use traditional natural resource management techniques. So I modeled each of the Huckett basins separately because I want to match up with the planning that's going on in the area. But one thing we have found is that this landscape seems to be quite driven by that evaporative demand, the eddy, as well as soil moisture and snow water equivalent. We see really cool, I mean, I think it's really cool, threshold behavior with eddy, which really points to the fact that we really could monitor eddy and then be able to anticipate ecological impacts once it crosses a threshold. We also see greater impact in drier places on the landscape. That really helps us pinpoint predicting the locations. And we see that plant density does matter. More dense forests are more likely to experience mortality during drought in this area. So that's just a little bit about the science and trying to link that vulnerability to adaptation strategies on the ground. But at the end of the day, you know, again, we're trying to just put ecological drought on the table and sort of get started here. And a big component of this is just your perception of drought and what do you see? You know, do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? And in our BAMS paper, we lined out a few different types of ecological drought, and we wanted to think specifically about these impacts and feedbacks to natural systems, as well as impacts and feedbacks to human systems. And you may imagine a situation where the natural system crosses a threshold and you see widespread ecological impacts, but maybe for some reason that it didn't, you know, influence the human system as much. However, you know, there's a bunch of different ways to look at this. So you could have a type 2 drought where maybe the natural impact really wasn't that strong from an ecological perspective, but it really mattered to people on the landscape. The reality is that this type 3 drought where both systems are impacted is going on, or you may have an even stronger drought where these changes are persistent in time. And so Amanda Cravens is leading an effort through looking at our interview data to try and understand all these folks who are stakeholders in this National Drought Resilience Partnership, what kind of drought do they see? And what has their experience been in the past, and how can we learn from that? Okay, with that, I just want to list all the EcoDrought products that are either out. So the first 3 in blue are either published or in review. And then the purple ones we're still working on. And we're super excited to keep this rolling. We're focusing a little bit in the future on that ecological vulnerability work and trying to link it to adaptation strategies. So we're hoping to sort of develop a tool and sort of a clearinghouse for adaptation strategies that are specific to drought and the ecological impacts. So with that, I want to thank mostly the USGS for fully funding this work, as well as the whole SNAPP crew of NCEAS, the Nature Conservancy and Wildlife Conservation Society. And with that, I can take any questions if I have any time left.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Shelley. We do have time for questions, so feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you tell who might be, I mean, is there like a hand sort of thing?
Can I see them?
Yeah, I don't see any hands up.
So it seems, in looking at your stakeholders, what sort of regulatory or management relationships do they have in working together? I mean, within that watershed, I guess working in the Upper Missouri watershed, there are some ongoing networking or relationships that have already been in place. So you're working within a community that already has some sort of knowledge network put together. Were there new partners brought in as well, and how do they respond in thinking about drought and how their ability to respond to drought?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually what you're highlighting is we found first off the bat, you know, when we're talking about, say, forest impacts and we're talking to drought planners, they're automatically like, well, I can't control the forest, so I need the Forest Service at the table. And so that has been kind of the work that Anshwin has done at the Montana DNRC to integrate more of those natural resource managers into the community. as well. And so there are, to say that it's a regulatory relationship, I think would be going a little far, but people are sitting at the table together, they're talking about how their decisions will influence a different sector. And so that's something we've really been interested in trying to promote in that landscape. But honestly, I don't know if Molly Cross is on the phone, but she would probably know a little more about how that group is merging together.
Hi guys, this is Molly. I think you kind of captured it well, Shelley. There definitely is a concerted effort being led by Ann Schwend at Montana DNRC and the local EPA office in the region to try to kind of create a group that is collaborating on drought planning that goes beyond sort of the typical players that have been part of drought planning in the past in Montana. So definitely creating some new partnerships there, although, at various scales in this landscape, there are a lot of collaborations between, say, the Forest Service working in the uplands part of the watershed and the watershed groups, which are usually more community members that are working in the lower part of the watershed. So there are coordination and collaboration happening already across agencies and the different players that are involved. But Ann Schwend and Montana DNRC are really working hard to try to formalize that more.
Can I add to that? This is Amanda.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one place that there are more formal regulatory relationships is in fisheries management. And I think that's one of the things that the resources paper definitely pulled out, and the analysis that's under further, that we're still working on with National Drought Mitigation Center is really highlighting is that because of the endangered species, with fish, it's very formal because it's required. As Shelley and Molly have said, with forests, it tends to be built on networks and very good collaborative relationships, but less of a formal regulatory structure because there aren't necessarily laws or policies that require that.
So when you start looking at short-term responses, I could see where a lot of the management plans can be effective. It's sort of looking at longer-term climate phenomena where if there's a regime shift in the climate system so that persistent droughts occur, even with the forest systems, then thinking about how do are there mitigating practices like forest thinning, looking at other replanting, restoration type activities that take that into account under a drought scenario. Are those type of considerations that are being brought into discussions of drought plans at this point?
Yeah, exactly. I think those types are being thought about a lot. I think what Ann Schwinn is trying to promote especially is this idea of preparedness strategies and being proactive, as well as just simply putting ecosystems on the table. So yeah, trying to understand, well, one, can thinning even be effective? And two, if so, where would we do that? And so yeah, that's what my science is trying to do, is reach out to those communities and say, are there some preparedness strategies that we can at least consider and think about together throughout planning community?
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly where we're headed.
I'd be interested, Amanda, to hear what you guys are seeing in the drought plan and the natural resource management plan review that you're doing. My understanding is that a lot of the formal drought plans are more what I would call drought response plans, or what they call, I think they acknowledge that they are drought response plans, where they are more of the, when we have a drought, how are we going to change our water use and do some shared sacrifice and things like that. And some of those are more formally covered. I think some of the more proactive work is happening outside of the formal drought planning processes and is happening more in the broader watershed restoration plans, watershed restoration work, natural resource management planning and work that's going on, that some of the more proactive strategies may be happening in those contexts, but that the drought planning to date has largely been response planning. And as Shelley mentioned, part of the move with this sort of current push for some proactive drought planning is to also encourage more preparedness strategies, not just response strategies.
So, I mean, I think this is where you kind of have to break down what level of drought planning you're thinking about. So the watershed level plans that appear in that resources article, the early Ruby plan from the 1980s is a dewatering plan. It's literally about 3 pages, and it, I mean, it wasn't even digital. It was an OCR nightmare. And that is a very early thing that is absolutely a drought plan. It's about ensuring water for downstream users. The 2016 plan that was written for the Beaverhead was written as part of this National Drought Resilience Framework, and that incorporates by reference the watershed plans, the BLM plans that Pat Fossey, the director of the Dillon Field Office, has been doing for her areas. There's a huge contrast between those 2 documents, and I think they reflect a really different context in the way that the watershed coordinator who wrote that 2016 plan, who was thinking this much more holistic environment influenced by the National Drought Resilience Partnership, compared to, you know, that very early plan. The ones in between really fall on kind of a spectrum, but I think that, and then there's a couple of watersheds that have not yet produced plans but are going to be producing them, again, as part of this larger National Drought Resilience Partnership funded similarly to the Beaverhead through the funding that Ann Schwen has gotten for those coordinators to actually even be in those positions. And so I think that it's true, traditionally drought planning has not played that role, but given those informal networks, it seems to at least be making a shift, even just in, you know, the mention of these other plans as documents for someone reading the drought plan. I think the other thing to mention is there's always a difference between law or policy or plan on the books and what happens in practice. So whether that goes through to how those plans are used is another question, but there certainly is a shift going on based on all of these networks and informal collaborations.
Thanks, Amanda. Looks like Ryan has his hand up and he typed something in the chat too, but Ryan, go ahead.
I was just wondering if there are any municipal or in particular Corps of Engineer impoundments in this watershed. My sense from other areas of the country is that while a lot of groups get together and have pretty good ideas when it comes to actual implementation of some of these, especially nature-based solutions, that the Corps is not able to easily incorporate those into their rulings and plans.
That's a great question, and I wonder if either Molly or Amanda could field it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you want me to take it?
Yeah.
So it is upstream of most of the Army Corps stuff on the Missouri. There is Clark Canyon Reservoir is the biggest reservoir in the upper Missouri. But the Bureau is the biggest player. The Army Corps wouldn't actually talk to us as part of our interview study, despite some pretty determined trying. But I think you have something similar with the Bureau, perhaps to a lesser extent than the Corps. The one significant municipality in this area is Bozeman, but I think you bring up a really good point, which is that compared to a lot of areas of the country, this is a relatively pristine area. There's a lot of public land and there's a lot of, you know, relatively undeveloped land.
We maybe have time for one more question before we need to move on.
So are there plans to sustain this effort in a way of keeping this type of dialogue moving forward as, you know, sort of plans evolve as they get implemented and you see successes or failures with these things? It seems like this is an initial start of a learning process. And so continued dialogue and interactions among these groups would be really valuable, but I don't know if there's a mechanism in place.
Well, with the administration change, it's a
Yeah.
little questionable. I think though that Anne still has a little bit of funding to keep this group going, but I don't think that there is any clear mechanism for how to
Are
continue.
there, within the leadership and planning teams up there, are there champions who see value in this effort? You would hope so, and that they would, informally continue this on.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Molly, you're going to answer it better, but I would say yes, there are definitely champions.
Yeah, I can speak to that just a little bit. So the Montana DNRC has funding from the Bureau of Rec to continue on with the drought planning work. So the development of the basin-wide plan that covers the 8 different watersheds that Shelley showed earlier, and then to continue to channel funding to the individual watersheds for them to initiate drought planning processes. So there is some continued funding through that, and that is keeping the effort moving forward. It definitely, a little bit of air was let out of the sails with the change in administration and no longer kind of having that National Drought Resilience Partnership to really drive things. But the head of Montana's DNRC, the director, is really supportive of this. They are expanding the approach they're taking in the Upper Missouri headwaters to the Yellowstone watershed, to the Upper Clark Fork watershed. So they're very committed to this kind of approach to doing drought planning and to incorporating the different elements that Shelley emphasized in terms of creating partnerships across the different agencies, in terms of bringing in the ecosystem perspective, and in terms of creating more of a preparedness, forward-looking kind of approach to drought planning. So I think that we will definitely continue to see this work in the state moving forward, albeit maybe a little bit more less well funded, maybe less of a high level national scale motivation. And then with the SNAP work, we got some additional funding from SNAP to keep our piece going and our engagement in this work going at least for about another year.
So one other thing, sorry, Molly, just going to add one thing when you're done.
Go ahead, go for it.
The one other thing that Montana has done that is super creative and adds some capacity is they have linked their AmeriCorps program to watershed health. So the AmeriCorps members in Montana, rather than working on a range of social issues, they're working on watersheds. And so some of the people doing watershed, helping with watershed planning, or like being based in a conservation district in some of these local watersheds are actually AmeriCorps members. And that's another capacity thing that I think will be helping as they expand this.
Great.
All right. Well, thanks, Shelley. We appreciate you coming over today. But we're going to kind of move to the sorry, we'll just do this one more from Shannon. She said you showed a lot of journal publications. Can you talk more about what sort of decision support tools information have you created or will you create?
Yeah, Shannon, good question. So our second set of funding that we have from SNAP is to start creating a tool and sort of a clearinghouse for adaptation strategies. And so there, what we're trying to do is take both a really sort of quantitative perspective that I've taken, but also a really even conceptual or qualitative understanding of past drought impacts and what has driven them, and to kind of come up with a library of adaptation strategies for folks to consider, but also sort of a tool in which managers could even play games with, like, if I enacted this particular strategy on the landscape, what might the impact be in terms of reducing vulnerability. So that's just up right now. And yeah, that's what our SNAP work is funding at this point.
And if I could jump in real quickly there too, Shelley, I mean, there's a lot of things that we would love to be able to do in terms of following up on the many different threads that Shelley mentioned. We've started with this work. Not all of them have, so the piece Shelley just mentioned has some targeted funding right now, but there are other things we would like to be able to do if we can garner the resources and time to do it, which is things like with the ecosystem services work that Shelley mentioned, turning the conversation, like, sort of providing some resources back to the watershed level drought planners that are, things like in the form of more common language questionnaires that they could utilize when guiding community-based discussions on their, drought concerns about drought impacts and how it could impact ecosystems and services that they care about, but how to do that in a way that's really more accessible to the kinds of community level discussions that the drought planners are having. In terms of just, again, more accessible language, not necessarily couched in the ecosystem services language that's more formal or academic. So we have ideas on some of those ideas on how we could have ideas on some of those kinds of resources we could try to develop. Not all of them do we kind of currently have funding to move forward, so we'll have to see which ones we can assess would be the most use. That the drought planners would find most valuable, and then ways to try to move some of those forward. So some ideas, but not necessarily able to move forward on all of them all at once.
Great. Okay, thanks.